Hello, everyone. Welcome to the hashtag Slavery Archive digital initiative, podcast, and book talks. And today we are very happy to be here with Crystal Nicole Eddins. And you are going to be discussing her book, Rituals, Runaways, and the Haitian Revolution, Collective Action in the African Diaspora, which was published in 2022 with Cambridge University Press. And here is the book. For those of you who didn't read it yet, then today we're going to have this conversation, and I hope the podcasting encourages you to read the book. Then let me just introduce Crystal before we start the conversation. Crystal Eddins, she is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Pittsburgh, and she is the author of this is her first monograph, Rituals, Runaways, and the Haitian Revolution, Collective Action in the African Diaspora, which was published in 2022 by Cambridge University Press. She has other works published that appeared in journals, the Journal of World Systems Research, the Journal of Haitian Studies, and also in Gender and History. Her areas of research and teaching interest include the African diaspora and historical sociology, social movements and revolutions, race and ethnicity, women and gender, 18th century Caribbean, and the digital humanities. And her ongoing research focuses on the role of shared consciousness, cultures, and identities within collective actions of the African diaspora. Welcome, Crystal. We are happy to have you here. Thank you for accepting this invitation. And I would like to start with a question that I will be asking to other people that I will be interviewing here. Our audience who is listening to us perhaps did not read your book yet. Could you tell us in a few words what your book, Rituals, Runaways, and the Haitian Revolution, Collective Action in the African Diaspora is about?
Hi, sure. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here. So the book, Rituals, Runaways, and the Haitian Revolution, tells the story of how captive Africans and people of African descent who were born in the Caribbean, how they came together from a multitude of backgrounds of geographic, ethnic, religious, and cultural backgrounds, and came together through different networks of resistance, through networks of ritual practice, sacred practices, and through their shared escapes, their attempts to free themselves from plantations. And through those common activities, those common resistance practices, began to forge a sense of solidarity that was opposed to slavery, and that would eventually culminate in the sense of racial solidarity that underpinned the success of the Haitian Revolution.
Wonderful. And this is really a big book, and you are going to discuss more elements regarding how you build this book and your primary sources and the questions that you are asking. But this is your first book, then, from what I understand, is a book that originally started with your doctoral dissertation. I don't know if you could tell us a little bit about how and why you decided to do this kind of research, and specifically about this topic, and what were the main challenges that you had here to transform the book from that dissertation that is an exercise that you were doing in the context of a PhD program into a book that is reaching then much wider audiences?
Sure. So the book is a culmination of my undergraduate and graduate work at Michigan State University. I did an undergraduate minor or specialization in African American history and culture, and then that led to me joining the African American and African Studies graduate program, and then the Department of Sociology. So at that time, I was just really interested in Black history, but I also became very interested in some of the theoretical and conceptual ideas within the discipline of sociology and how that kind of helped me understand the world. But I was really interested in, Black radicalism, the ways that Black communities have come together to transform themselves, to transform societies. And I was also really interested in the role that women and religion played in those types of activities. And so initially I was wanting to do the dissertation on Black women in the Haitian Revolution. I took a class as a lifelong education student on Caribbean spirituality. And it was through that class that I became more familiar with the Haitian Revolution and the role of Haitian Vodou and the Bois Cayman ceremony and Cecile Fatiman. And, the story just kind of grabbed me and, pulled me in, so to speak. And so without some of the archival evidence to kind of speak to women, though, I mean, we know from, the scholarship of people like Trio, and then more recently, folks like Vanessa Holden and Marissa Fuentes have talked about the ways that archives silence not only enslaved people's voices, but enslaved women's voices as well. So I wasn't able to do the dissertation specifically on women and the Haitian Revolution, but I also was wanting to explore the idea of where enslaved people's revolutionary consciousness came from. Some of the existing literature kind of range in terms of their outlook on this question. Some of it more so attributed this revolutionary consciousness to the events in France, the French Revolution, and basically speculated or asserted that enslaved people could not or would not have been thinking about revolution prior to 1791. And this was something that I also kind of took umbrage toward. I didn't like this idea that that Black people could not or would not have been thinking in revolutionary terms. And so I wanted to set out to try to understand and to explore what kinds of resistance and revolutionary activities may have predated 1791 to give a demonstration that the environments and the societies in which African captives were being brought from were rife with societal changes and transformations. And so this idea, so on top of that, given the conditions in colonial Haiti, how deadly they were, how brutal they were, how much people were being overworked, there's just no way that people were not wanting to and thinking about how to free themselves and how to transform the system that they had unfortunately found themselves in. And so that's kind of how the journey toward this research topic began. And then in transforming the dissertation to a book, that was also another challenge. Thankfully, I had a fellowship at the John Carter Brown Library, as well as, and then later I did a fellowship at the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. I did a postdoc at the CSSJ. That gave me the time and space to kind of conceptualize the chapters. The dissertation had been 3 unusually large article-style chapters, which is more common in sociology and other fields like economics. I think they do that in there as well. But I wanted to kind of break it up and really try to develop an argument over the course of several chapters and to ensure that each chapter would have its own story to tell that would also lend to that broader argument. And so I'd spent the better part of 2018 and 19 at the CSSJ, just doing revisions, re-examining some of the archival materials that I had looked at the CSSJ as well, at the John Carter Brown Library, since they have the Haiti collection there. Re-examining some of the materials that I had gotten from Aix-en-Provence and from Paris and the UK, and just really kind of rethinking how I wanted to kind of come up with this argument and frame it in a way that was closer to a storytelling format.
Thank you so much. And it's interesting because to some extent, I think that you already answered the question that I would like to ask you now, which is but I think that perhaps you have some elements to add or some words to add. Of course, there are many books, especially in English, but also in French, some in Spanish, about very few in Portuguese, about the Haitian Revolution. But in which ways that you think that this book is different from the other books that are out there by other historians and scholars? To some extent, you already emphasized that you were looking to the period that led to the revolution and not necessarily about to provide an account of the revolution. But if you had to think about in terms of what would be the few features that make this book different from the other books, telling the history or exploring the context of the Haitian Revolution?
Sure. So I think for me, the main thing that distinguishes this work is that it's an intentionally Black studies project, in the sense that it is centered on focusing on the ways that African people attempted to humanize themselves. It intentionally draws on the work of Black American, Caribbean, Haitian scholars, people like Creole, people like Jean Casimir, Cedric Robinson, Ruth Sims Hamilton, who had been a sociologist at MSU, and other folks who have begun theorizing, of course, CLR James, Black scholars who have long been theorizing the role of resistance in the Haitian Revolution, the significance of the Haitian Revolution and other Black revolts to the making of the modern world, thinking about the ways that enslaved people were commodified by and challenging the commodification of capitalism. So kind of situating Haiti within the world system in that way. So in the sense that, so on one hand, I'm using an explicitly Black studies framework, but then also I think part of what is also important about this work is that it's interdisciplinary. So in addition to Black studies, using some of the ideas, I think, from the social movements field also kind of helped me be able to tease out and explain some of the patterns that I was seeing from the archival material and from other secondary sources in ways that perhaps other scholars had not fully explained.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I think that this leads us to the next question. Because, I am a historian and I've been, then most of what we have been doing with the initiative is associated with the work of historians. Now, you were trained as mainly as a sociologist, then with an MA in sociology and the PhD then in sociology and African American studies. Now, still your work, the work that you do here in this book with the primary sources is very similar to the work that the historians do with primary sources, which is why I think that many historians, they love this book. And I would like to know about then a little bit about your primary sources. You already mentioned then John Carter Brown Library, the collection that they have there of the Haitian Revolution, but you mentioned Aix-en-Provence, archives in Paris. Tell us a little bit about the primary sources that you used, in addition, of course, that as a sociologist, this theoretical framework is central to your work, but what about the primary sources? What are they? What were their main advantages? And I would say what would be their main limitations as well?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, we know that in the sources related to slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, that enslaved Africans' voices and perspectives are not often at the forefront, and typically they're not. And so, in a place like colonial Haiti, where there was such a heightened level of repression and exploitation, oftentimes the perspectives or the the appearance of names or of dates or any kind of accounting of an enslaved person or an enslaved rebel typically comes from materials that are not only from the colonial state or from plantations, but they appear when there's some type of reporting on rebellion and the attempt to repress that rebellion. So this would be things like police reports or some kind of condemnation of rebels who had been arrested and sentenced to death or some other type of punishment. So the Moreau de Sainte Marie collection in Aix-en-Provence was very useful in terms of just describing different types of cases. I'm trying to remember where this, I don't think this was in Aix-en-Provence. I'm thinking of some of the letters about one of the midwives named Marie Catherine Kingay. The letters about her from plantation owners in the northern area, they're going directly to the police, they're going directly to the local judge about her, kind of complaining about the power that this woman is wielding within the nearby plantation communities. So coming from these kind of authoritative records and trying to kind of parse through and kind of flip the narrative, so to speak. So the archival records are it's somewhat few and far between, but the largest body of archival material that I used, that I was lucky enough to be able to have access to, were the advertisements for maroon runaways that were published in the colonial newspapers, mainly in the paper Les Affiches Américaines from 1766 to 1791. These advertisements had been digitized and published in an online database, the Marronnage and Saint-Domingue database. At least that was what it was called in its first iteration. I think it's been since renamed. But that database of advertisements was just really rich in terms of not only the number of advertisements that there were for the different, women, men, and children who were escaping plantations and being sought after by the colonial authorities, by plantation authorities. But oftentimes the contents of those advertisements was really rich in terms of giving descriptions of the individuals, describing some of their ethnic backgrounds, describing some of the labor skills and tasks that they would have been performing on the plantations, the connections that they might have had to family members and other kith and kin in other parts of the colony. And so I tried my best to use these advertisements not in a way that would kind of replicate the intention of them, which is to track and re-enslave Black people, but to try to understand the intent behind these ads in terms of the enslaved person's intent to free themselves and what the advertisements might give us a hint at. So in terms of the limitations, obviously, we don't really know what happens to these people outside of the moment that this advertisement appears in the newspaper. We don't know if they get arrested, if they're recaptured, if they are somehow re-enslaved. But we do know that at least for a certain moment in time or a certain period of time, whether it was 6 weeks or 6 months, that they had taken flight from a plantation and that they had some intention on not returning and being free. And so building on that assumption is how I was able to kind of explain more about enslaved people's intentionality, how they were attempting to kind of form communities through escape and to live as human beings with dignity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, and I think also that another very rich element in those ads is that many of these people who are running away were African born, as those who participated in the revolution. And even through that link, we have also a lot of information. And it's really very rich. Now, I would like to talk a little bit more then about this idea of marronnage. Then your book shows us then, as you already said, but I will repeat here for those who are listening to us, that the rise of the Sandomingo Revolution was, of course, preceded by this long tradition of marronnage, then our Black protest or Black rebellion. Now, can you tell us a little bit more about what is marronnage in this context? Because you mentioned the ads, but there are several people are running away under several conditions. Then could you tell us a little bit more about the context, and if there are any preferred cases from or stories from these ads or from the book that you'd like to share with us?
Sure. So when we think of the term marronnage, it originates from the Spanish term cimarron, which is deeply rooted in the context of the island Española, Haiti, which later becomes Saint Domingue and Santo Domingo. And this is because many of the first Africans and the first Africans to participate in revolt against slavery and colonialism takes place right in Haiti, in those southern central plain mountains called the Bauruco Mountains. So as early as 1521, and even prior to that in 1503, Africans and indigenous people are escaping sugar plantations. They're escaping the gold mines under Spanish rule, and they're escaping into the Bauruco Mountains and forming communities there. And they're also staging incursions and attacks on the plantation systems. And so the practice of subversion is deeply rooted in the colony's history, in the island's history. By the time we get to the French period, there's shifts in the ways that the environment, the geography and the political economy are changing. The French come in the late 17th century, early 18th century, and implement a sugar production that is, much more rigorous than the Spanish had done in decades prior. And so the overwhelming volume of Africans are being brought into the island. An overwhelming volume of sugar is being produced through their forced labor, and escaping is a much more dangerous endeavor. But I would argue that even through those systematic challenges, that the legacy of those 16th century Africans, and other scholars argue this previously, people like Haitian anthropologist Rochelle Beauvoir-Dominique, who argues that it's the legacy of those 16th and 17th century Africans that continues to live on well into the 18th century. And I believe that there is evidence, or at least that it's plausible that not only is their legacy alive, but the descendants of those early Maroons are still living in those mountains, right? They're still living in the mountains in the Bauruco area. They're living in the mountains in what becomes known as the Grand Anse Peninsula in the southwest area of Haiti. They're living in the mountains of outside of Port-au-Prince. So in the early 18th century, you have a priest named Pierre Labat, who attests to the idea that, or he states in some of his notes, that there are as many as 700 Maroons, armed Maroons, living in the mountains outside of Port-au-Prince. And then even later, there is a marronnage, or a fugitive slave police captain named, gosh, of course, I'm forgetting his name now. Let's see if I can find it quickly. Claude Milson. He was also a planter, a marronnage lieutenant, and then later he becomes an advocate for the free people of color. But he also describes some of his encounters in fighting with Maroons and trying to capture Maroons. And one of these kind of skirmishes that he describes, he's fighting against as many as 300 Maroons. And so in different areas of the colony where there was still enough, I guess, flexibility or geographic isolation where these communities were, continuing to thrive to the extent that, many of them probably were born free. They were born within these communities and had not been enslaved. And so part of what I'm arguing in the book is that it's the influence from these Maroon communities and their connections to plantations, their connections to enslaved people, that helps to create like a fabric of resistance and a broader network of resistance that then leads to the revolution.
Thank you. And it's interesting then that you put this, of course, you want to come back before the revolution, but it's very important to emphasize the fact that the first rebellions and the first Maroon communities were were there exactly in the same region, because I come from Brazil originally, and of course Brazil has one of these largest and long-lasting Maroon communities, that is Palmares, but this is the 17th century, and there we are referring really to the very first years of the presence of the Spanish in that area. Now, I'd like to ask another question that is somewhat related, and if I become too repetitive, then just jump the way you would like to. Then I would say that several other scholars, some of them you already mentioned here, but several others, they study then the importance of a certain ethnic solidarity or even religious solidarity in times of rebellion. I think here especially about the work of João José Reis in Brazil, about the Malay Rebellion in Bahia, and this recent work, a recent book by Vincent Brown on the Tax Rebellion. Then, of course, that this is a period after the Haitian Revolution. But in these two rebellions, African-born enslaved people, they played an important role, if not the central role in the rebellions. And the context of Saint-Domingue was to some extent similar in terms of the great number of African-born enslaved men, women, and children. Could you tell us a little bit more about this connection between the number of African-born and the number of Creoles or locally born enslaved people, and how this idea of birthplace or Africa, because you are thinking in terms of the African diaspora in your work, and of course part of this idea refers to the motherland. How does this play a role in these acts of resistance or not?
Sure. So, again, kind of going back to the Spanish colonial period, even as early as the 15th and 16th century, Spanish colonizers are making a distinction that they think exists between Africans from the continent and Africans who have been, Hispanicized from the Iberian Peninsula. Right? So there's this kind of longstanding contention or belief that the African, or the so-called Bosale, is more would be more docile and would be more equipped to be enslaved, rather than the creolized or the Hispanicized Creole or Ladino, right? And so this distinction between the African-born and the colony-born, or the Creole, is an old one that would persist until the French colonial period. And even would continue into scholarship today, obviously, like you just mentioned. And so part of what I wanted to do was to just try to understand that and maybe tease that out a little bit. And one of the great things, and I'm glad you mentioned this before about the advertisements, is that many of them are descriptive, or at least give some indication of where some of these captive Africans' geographic origins may have been. To the extent that I found over 100 ethnonyms, or 100 different descriptors of place or identity. And so this becomes really, really helpful, especially in a place like Haiti, where because of the overwhelming exploitation, the overwhelming brutality and death in the colony, where nearly 2/3 of the newly arrived Africans are dying within 5 years, or being killed within 5 years. And so enslavers are then turning to the slave trade. They're turning to the trafficking in human flesh to replenish those lost laborers. And by 1789, over 2/3 of the enslaved population are African-born. And this is also, reflected in the advertisements, that about 2/3 of the runaways described in these advertisements were African-born. And the majority of those had been born in regions correlating to West Central Africa, or what is now Angola, Democratic Republic of Congo, etc. And so being able to attempt to link many of these individuals to a particular place on the African continent was helpful in terms of being able to try to understand the context from which they were coming from, the different societies, and what was happening in those places, what was happening in the Dahomey Kingdom, in the Oyo Empire, in Senegambia, in West Central Africa, the Luango Coast, and the Congo Kingdom, to be able to situate people in terms of their sociopolitical origins and context. And I think this becomes especially important when we look at the unfolding of the Haitian Revolution, especially kind of moving toward the push for independence. So Michel Rolfe-Trio talks about this in terms of the war within the war, where many of the officers who had gained rank in the military, in the French military, people like Jean-Jacques Dessalines, were actually momentarily participating in the repression of the quote unquote Bosal, or the African-born rebels, the Maroons, who refused to accept any type of conciliation with the French, and insisted on continuing to fight for freedom and to fight for independence, until Dessalines then turns on the French again himself, and then goes on to lead what becomes known as the Indigenous Army to independence in 1804. But just being able to kind of draw a line between those practices, that long history of African resistance, of the Bosal, and to tease apart and pull apart what those categories are, and to really debunk some of the ideas that these groups were self-segregating, that they didn't really want to have anything to do with one another, that they didn't have anything in common. I really also wanted to kind of challenge those ideas. And so by looking at birth origin, and looking at the ways that people from different birth origins or from different places were still coming together in solidarity, I think helps to better understand resistance in a broader way, rather than just thinking about it in only ethnic terms, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And my next question would be related to this idea, and I think that you already brought this dimension, like in a way that is very clear in terms of even the diversity of then even if you have these 2/3 of African-born individuals, there is a great there is a great level of diversity in terms of from where these Africans are coming from. You mentioned then the Bight of Benin and the Luango Coast and what is the region of present-day Angola in West Central Africa as well. But one of the elements that I would like to ask you, and you mentioned in the beginning that these were your very first interest in terms of research when you were looking at the Saint-Domingue Revolution, is the issue of women and resistance. I don't know if you would like to tell us a little bit more about the role of women in these acts of resistance, and of course that these women, they are in the ads at least, and they played roles in the movement before the revolution and during the revolution. But much of what we know about the Saint-Domingue Revolution has to do with the actions of men, then Toussaint Louverture, you mentioned Dessalines. And what about women then? In which ways you think that women's resistance in the context of the work that you did here differ, or perhaps not, from the ways that men resisted against slavery in Saint-Domingue?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, what I found, at least in the book, or what I present in the book, is that in many ways, women were doing some of the exact same things that men were doing, in terms of especially plantation labor, working in the sugarcane fields and the coffee fields. So they're doing the same physical labor. When it comes to resistance, women are taking on maybe more unique roles, I think. So when we look at some of the cases around poisonings, for example, in the Mackandal conspiracy, this conspiracy to attempt to poison all of the whites in the Northern Plain in the 1750s. What I see there is women taking the role of couriers, or being the connective tissue between a figure like Mackandal and the surrounding plantations to distribute these poison packets. And in many cases, women are the ones being executed and interrogated for these poisonings. So they're facing the same punishments for resistance. But the practices, I think, of the ways that women were able to help to build communities across plantations is one that has stood out to me, and was one that I wanted to continue to explore. So in the Peace and Gender and History is where I began to think about family and motherhood, and using one of the maroon rosters that described the families who had been attempting to reach a treaty with the French and colonial authorities in the 1780s, looking at the ways that it describes households of women, men, and children living together, and seeing how these family units were not more cohesive, but essentially these families were able to have more children than were enslaved women on plantations. Because the plantation conditions were so harsh, women were either deciding to opt out of allowing their reproduction to be exploited for the plantation benefit, and so they were using different types of herbal medicines as abortifacients to induce abortions. There were cases of infanticide, but in the maroon roster and in the paper, Rejoice, Your Wombs Will Not Beget Slaves, part of what I argue is that becoming a maroon and engaging in marronnage was another way in which women were attempting to not only reclaim their children from slavery, but reclaim their wombs from being the mechanism through which slavery was reproduced.
Thank you. And this is really this is really one of the fascinating dimensions of the book. I would like to ask you a question that is, of course, part of the title of the book, that is the role of Vodou and also other African-based religions in the revolution. If you would have something to tell us about that perhaps you didn't cover, then we'll talk a little bit more in terms of solidarity in general, ethnic lines, but what is the role of religion here? Then in a colony that we have so many people who were born in the continent with different traditions, at the same time, a colony that was, at least in theory, Catholic, because the French were imposing Catholicism, but how was the role of religion in all this conversation about revolt that we would like to highlight here?
Sure, yeah. So even though the Africans being brought into the colony were coming from different geographic regions, one of the things that they did have in common that I outlined in the first chapter is that many of them were coming from areas where there was an existing connection between the sacred and the political world, where political leaders were also sacred leaders, were also religious leaders, and used religious practice and used religious theology or religious ideas, spiritual ideas, as well as spirits themselves, right? The Orisha, as well as other deities, to invoke a sense of commitment from everyday people within those respective societies. And so I argue that this is kind of a principle that gets carried over into the colony, where enslaved people are seeking out and using the skills and the tools of sacred practitioners, people who have the skills to communicate with the deceased, to communicate with the spirit world, to make use of the physical world for spiritual purpose, to be able to use different materials to invoke spirit beings. There's a certain power that is accumulated through these skills and through this knowledge and through this know-how. And those skills and that power, I argue, translates into a certain level of political power. And so the relationship between, I think, Vodou and the Haitian Revolution, and we see this in other, revolts of the Americas as well, is a close one, where people are looking to the leadership figures within their communities. They're turning to the spirit world for strength and to kind of reinforce their strength and whatever their needs are in the physical realm. And they are coming together across different lines. They're coming together across ethnic lines and creating new rituals and new practices and new senses of solidarity and new ways of thinking about spirit beings. So, for example, one of the things that I kind of theorize or think about the Bois-Quémant ceremony, there's been debates about whether this was a Congo-based practice, because there had been a sacrifice of the pig, or there was a description of a pig being sacrificed during the Bois-Quémant ceremony. But there's also descriptions that speak to a blood oath. And so some scholars would claim that this is a Dahomean practice. But when we think about some of the Haitian Loa today, Saint-Jacques, who is also Ogun, that to me, the combination of those two deities into one is not only a reflection of African people embracing, French colonialism. That's the combination, I think, of the Baida Benin Orisha of Ogun being paired with the with the Congolese Saint James or Saint Jacques, who also was the god of war in the 16th and 17th centuries in the Congo. And so I think that there's a coming together that happens through these different practices that helps to, forge what becomes what we know of today as Vodou, that gives a certain authority and again, kind of helps to build that solidarity in terms of the revolt of 1791.
Thank you, Dan. This is also a fascinating dimension of the book that can lead to more developments in other works. One question that I didn't ask you, but I would like to ask you, is regarding free people of color and freed people as well. Then we talked a lot about the enslaved people, and of course that perhaps that especially during the Saint-Domingue Revolution, then freed people and free people of color, they played a role in the revolution as well. Can we see this role of people who are not enslaved or who are no longer enslaved in this period before the revolution? Because I was thinking about, for example, about the ads, the ads in the Les Affiches Américaines. Then the ads, they are referring to people who escape it. But freed people, of course, they are visible in the newspaper in other ways. But in terms of these acts of resistance against colonialism, what do we see about free people of color and formerly enslaved people? Do you have anything to add to that?
Sure. So I was going to mention that in the advertisements, there are several examples of Maroons being described as being harbored by free people of color. On the other hand, there's also examples of Maroons who are escaping slave owners who are free people of color. So there's a little bit of both there. But in terms of furthering the resistance, there are other accounts that talk about free people of color providing arms to Maroons. And in Cap Français, especially because that was a city where there was so much flux in terms of mobility and status, to where many enslaved people did become emancipated and but still maintain their connections and their sense of commitment to the enslaved population, right? And so there's accounts there talking about Maroons hiding out in some of the neighborhoods that were dominated by free people of color. And there's actually I think I talk about this in the 5th chapter, where there are kind of networks of like smuggling happening that included free people of color, Maroons, and enslaved people. So people, especially in Cap Français, I think, are coming together around a range of different activities. And yeah, in many of those cases, free people of color are either being accused of being complicit or are outright in support of some of these activities.
Yeah, and I can imagine also, of course, that some of these people at some point were referring to quintais, of course, that within even families, there were people who were born free and others were still enslaved and others were freed. And yeah, then this is really fascinating. Then how many branches the book bring to us. One question then that would be our last question, that is much more open. If you would like us to know then what you are planning in terms of the kind of work that you'll be doing or that you are doing now, either deriving from this book or I don't know how much related. The work that you are doing now or you'll be doing is connected to this book. And if you would like us to know a little bit about that, because it's important for us to continue following the work that you are doing.
Sure. So the paper that I was referring to on women and marronnage and family, that paper kind of introduced me to the concept of reproductive justice. This idea that women should have the right to have children, to not have children, and to be able to have children in sustainable and safe communities. And this is a concept that comes out of years of Black feminist work and third world feminist activism as well. And so part of what I'm kind of interested in now is just thinking about the ways that kind of the legacies of slavery and resistance shed light on or help us better understand and contextualize contemporary Black freedom struggles around things like reproductive justice, things like the demands for reparations, things like the fight for climate justice. And so I have some smaller things in progress around some of those questions, and just thinking about Black movements and racial capitalism across time and space. And so I want to kind of deal more with that and also think more about Black women's activities, again, historically and contemporarily, challenging racial capitalism through these different contemporary movements. But I'm also thinking about, in terms of a second monograph, potentially exploring the connections between gender and sacred practices and their role of resisting slavery a bit more in depth. I may go a little bit earlier in time period. I'm not 100% sure just yet. The Stonewall Rebellion does have my attention, and so my hope is to get back to South Carolina and to kind of look at some of the newspapers and see what I can find.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Now, this is fascinating. That rebellion deserves be revisited.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I am glad to hear that your first interest that was women will make back then in the is coming back in the work that you'll be doing
Yeah, it has to.
next. Yes. Oh, Crystal, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to have you. And again, for those of you who are watching or listening, this is the book that we had today, which is Rituals, Runaways, and the Haitian Revolution, Collective Action in the African Diaspora, Cambridge University Press, 2022, I am saying, but I'm not sure about the copyright. Dated that perhaps it was published in 2021, but the copyright is to 22. And this book is now, I think, in open access, if I am not mistaken. But is an important book, is a book that deserves to be assigned. And it's so rich for students and scholars who will find here a wealth of material to continue doing their works. And I am really happy, Crystal, that you came. And this was then the Slavery Archive Digital Initiative, book talks and podcast. And I hope that you continue following us. Thank you, Crystal.
Thank you so much. See you soon.